So Rafa's biography. Rafa is an undergraduate student in London at his final year. He's born in Greece from immigrant parents, and Rafa aims to provide the historical and philosophical framework of historical ranking that justified different oppressions in an effort to deepen the understanding of their construction and establish whether the intersectionality of struggle has historical context. So Rafa, when you are ready, you can begin.
Hi everyone. Sorry, let me share my screen. Right, can you see that?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, all good.
Yes, all good.
Right, so my name is Rafail Simoni. I'm 24 years old, soon to be, male, heterosexual, able, so I fit just perfectly the stereotyped white guy who's gonna talk about the oppression. My dissertation this year is focusing on the link between veganism and anti-racism. Despite being interested in animal liberation for many years, this was the year that I actually sat down and read a lot of academic work. And this basically is the presentation that I've noticed. This is, yeah, basically a sort of discussion of what I consider to be an important step forward into how we can effectively promote the liberation of non-human animals, and some bits that I have noticed through different academic work that I have personally noticed that are missing. So critical animal studies. So this is the definition that I'm going to be using for my presentation. Recently developed a disciplinary field that recognizes human exploitation of animals as a crisis. So it highlights the necessity for human, non-human animal, and earth liberation to be considered together under the political term total liberation. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the earth liberation, and then a little bit more about the non-human animal liberation from a psychological perspective, and how these two concepts affect us, our relationships as humans, and how we can move forward into creating a more egalitarian societies. So obviously, to begin with, I need to put forward some historical and philosophical approaches of oppression. My aim here is to establish the way we treat non-human animals and the earth, the nature, is not something contemporary, but it's a mindset that has been growing and growing up for thousands of years. Then I'm going to be talking about the non-human and earth liberation, and then I'm going to finish with some bullet points as to how I believe, I'm in line with Niebert's work as to how we can move towards interspecies liberation. I'm using this photo here because it's one of the things that I've noticed during my reading of the other academic work for my dissertation. The majority of this work talks about supremacism, white male human supremacism, and capitalism, while a lot of people are not talking about the socioeconomic system. But there is a lot, I've noticed that not a lot of people are talking about colonization. How has the mindset of the oppressor has influenced the way the oppressed are feeling towards other oppressed groups. So instead of breaking this line, they continue into promoting this kind of mindset. So in order to understand how colonization works, I'm going to briefly mention how, to our understanding, the historical background of how human societies were before the contemporary ones. So indigenous philosophy, this is the starting line, because we don't have any records of before. So we know that the hunter-gatherer societies were nomadic. So they weren't staying in one area for too long. They were staying in one area long enough for them to sustain themselves. And as soon as the nature was not sustainable anymore, they would move away. In that way, the nature would regrow itself, and humans will move into another area to survive. Now, I'm missing, the reference here is Bookchin. So Bookchin wrote a book about the natural hierarchies, the history of hierarchies. And he claimed that basically indigenous people viewed non-human animals as supernatural forces, as part of the spiritual path. He argued that these societies were organic and symbiotic instead of hierarchical, and that also they were egalitarian, so they were providing access to goods for all of the residents of the community. And this is an image of basically how indigenous people, this one is from Aboriginals, how they actually symbolized what they perceived as supernatural forces, and all of them are natural elements, non-human animals and the sun. So while we were moving towards a new era, Diamond argued that the move from forager to farmer was the worst mistake in our human history. He basically argued that when we started domesticating non-human animals, that was far more traumatic and heavy than when we were domesticating plants. Because obviously when you domesticate non-human animals, there is interaction with another living being. So the society has had a reflection on how this cultural change was happening, and we can see that through how religion was perceived. So on the top image, we can see a pagan god, which is quite anthropomorphic. And in the bottom image, we see Zeus, which is the god of the 12 gods of Greece. These are who's quite obviously a human-shaped god figure. So at this point, humans started to domesticate non-human animals, and they needed to reason for this sort of exploitation. And the best way to do that was to reshape the supernatural figures that by then they were considering them as friends or part of them, part of a holistic. They had a holistic approach towards every single living thing, including nature. At this point, we see that they started perceiving higher forces as anthropomorphic, and this is some sort of reflection of how humans actually started perceiving the world as them, as the world being there for them to exploit. And one of the major historical points where this is evident is during the Uruk period in Mesopotamia. So anthropologists like Algaza et al., they argued that during that period is the first time where we actually see agricultural classification, but also hierarchical structures, slavery, class stratification, warfare, and colonial expansion. So drawing from this information, Patterson, but also I think it was Stephen Best, that they were arguing that basically non-human animal domestication was the first form of hierarchy, and speciesism is the foundation of every other form of exploitation. Arguably, it's not coincidence that in the same period where people were domesticating non-human animals, human population was started growing, because obviously they had increased their chances for survival through consuming them. And then at the same point, we see human-to-human oppression through hierarchical structures, colonial expansion, warfare. So we can see that by then, the indigenous philosophy was shaping a way towards a dominating worldview. Moving forward a couple of thousands of years.
Rafa? I'm sorry. You can hear me okay?
I can hear you okay, yeah.
Yep, okay. Your volume seems to have gone a bit quiet, sort of all of a sudden. Yeah, not sure what that is. Like, we can still hear you, but it's just kind of a little quieter. So I guess just wanted to let you know that. I don't know, yeah, if there's any adjustment you could make, or
I don't know, the same position as it was. Let me close the other program. Is that any better?
I think that still sounds the same, unfortunately.
No? No.
Oh, yep. I
Is it
think that's
better?
better.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Sounds good. So sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you for letting me know.
Okay.
Right. So moving into the ancient Greek era, which is like, so Uruk period was around 6,000 years ago from this date. So we're talking now about ancient Greece, 3,000 years ago. And the classical Greek philosophy, which basically it's established as the dominant philosophy within Western societies at this moment. So Aristotle was one of the main philosophers back in the day, and he was arguing that he was actually he sequenced the natural hierarchy, which positioned women as servers of men, slaves as servers of masters, and non-human animals as servers of humans. So he sequenced this great chain of being, which is quite interesting topic, because even if you look at it now, you can see that to this date, this hierarchical structure that places religion above prime ministers, kings, whatever, on the top as well, after common people, and then non-human animals and the earth, is still the dominant philosophy to this date, which is basically, so basically we have this kind of philosophy which is like quite few thousands of years old. And I would argue that when you have this kind of hierarchy, and when we approach a struggle single-handedly, is the same hierarchical mind sort of way of thinking comes to practice as well. So when we only focus on human oppression, is because we don't really consider non-human animal oppression as important as the earth oppression as important as well. So Aristotle placed rationality as the most important factor. Ironically, rationality is the main aspect that humans have, let's say, superior compared to other animals. However, this aspect of concept of rationality was the one that justified also racism and sexism. So if we move back like 500 years ago, during the colonialism of European countries, we can see that rationality was the main reason that people were actually claiming that different people were superior or inferior to them. And obviously, women were perceived as less rational or intelligent as males. So it's quite interesting how rationality is the distinction between humans and non-human animals, but it was also used to justify sexism and racism. Obviously, yeah, like they needed to bring those people into an animalistic level, as it was argued from the previous presentation. So when we look at the great chain of being, at the bottom, there is the earth. Arguably, the most important bit is at the bottom. So moving on to understanding how nature affects human psychology. So there was this research by Baxter and Pelletier, who actually took evidence and research from ecological aspects. And they were arguing that rural environments have a positive impact compared to urban environments. Also, Meyer and France in 2004 argued that connection to nature can improve feelings of egalitarianism and belonging, while also viewing nature as a community can motivate increased empathic and altruistic behavior among humans. Macy argued that basically the way we oppress the environment and the thought of environmental destruction is causing an unconscious trauma, what's it termed as environmental psychic numbing. And this affects human-to-human interaction in the sense that if we are feeling that we are doing this ecological destruction and we have repressed that thought to that degree, it's oftentimes that we also behave through domination towards other humans. So I'm citing also to Carl Jung, a famous psychologist, who was also arguing that the dehumanization, the natural dehumanization from the Western civilization and the influences in human psychology were a tragedy, and then also that nature was providing some energy to humans that is now emotional energy that is now absent. I'm quoting also psychoanalyst Storr, who wrote that man treats nature in terms of dominance and submission as he might treat another human being. So how are we, so this distinction between human and nature has non-humans in the middle. So if we remember the great theme of being, humans are above non-human animals on Earth. So Mason was arguing basically that non-human animals are the most direct representatives of nature. So therefore, when we look at the way we view non-human animals is the same way as we're going to view nature. And this was backed up by recent research on vegans, who are the closest that we have to non-human animal rights. Vegans were highly connected to nature. They hold strong beliefs about the environment. Political research on veganism was also arguing that hierarchically minded people are more likely to deny human responsibility for climate change, and that also some ideological motives involved in the group biases. So when you favor we favor one group over another, are related to how we think about and treat animals and nature. So we can see that this human to non-human animal separation is the key towards understanding how we can bridge this separation with nature as well. So Western civilization and European societies did not really like the concept of humans being animals. They wanted to create a society where humans would go to work, would contribute to the economy, and therefore they created the animalistic morality as something negative. So people who were having a lot of sexual intercourses or who were denying political status quo, like for example in Greece, anarchists are being called people who do not wash themselves, like to reference them closely related to animals. And Bouillot was basically arguing that the construction of the animal as an antithesis of the ideal human has fortified the perception of hierarchies as natural. So it's a very important aspect for hierarchies to be considered natural. And this is something that we can see throughout conversations and in academia, that every single time hierarchy is coming into a discussion, its natural appeal always is being discussed as something unquestionable. Continuing with capitalism and how it has influenced the way we view non-human animals is also the language. So Niebert was arguing basically that when we refer to non-human animals as plainly animals, we do not include ourselves as part of the animal kingdom. For example, when we take the definition of veganism, and it takes, which is basically from Watson, that states as far as possible and applicable to not participate in any animal exploitation. So at the same time, does he talk about animals, non-human animals, or is it also humans? What does the definition stand for? Niebert also argued that capital, which is obviously the word that capitalism comes from, is the word origin comes from the head of cattle, which is one of the earliest forms of property and wealth, which has created obviously a lot of inequalities in human societies as well. So we can see the role of non-human animals in human society as part of the wealth. Arguably, the first form of capital was non-human animals. And recent research from Ruby and Heine were basically saying that when we categorize non-human animals as food sources, then we actually think of them as such. So we don't think of them as morally, we decrease our moral consideration for them. We don't think that they have any mental attributes, that they don't feel pain, just because the corporations and the way they frame words is so different to what is being actually consumed. So another aspect of how non-human violence is affecting human interactions come from work in from psychological criminologists. So recent research has also identified that when among adolescents, when they mistreat non-human animals, they might develop deviant behavior towards humans. Also, non-human animal abuse has been observed as a possible indicator for human violence, and slaughterhouse employment has been found to have rates of arrest increased for violent crimes compared to other employments. So here I'm citing a bit of quantitative psychological work of how human and non-human animal oppression is linked. There are plenty of recent works of how veganism and non-human animal rights are political. This one is from Don, Hodgson, and Lighty in 2016, where basically social domination orientation and right-wing authoritarianism were closely linked through authoritarian submission and aggression. Higher social dominance orientation is linked with racist, sexist, homophobic, and speciesist beliefs. Right-wing authoritarianism was correlated with meat consumption, support for non-human animal exploitation, and likelihood to be omnivore. Political conservatism was related to speciesism, and human outgroup prejudices and speciesism share common ideological motives. Once again, there is a lot of research, a recent one as well, quantitatively, that back up this theory of how non-human animal exploitation is, non-human animal views are actually affecting human views and vice versa. So political veganism, we're going a bit more mainstream here. Vegans were seen 15 times more likely to be liberal, and they were strongly motivated by the political implications of food choice. So basically, they were seeing diet as something political rather than just eating or something else. And Hodgson and Earl argued that relationships between political ideology and attitudes towards animal exploitation were linked, and also the ideology can predict the amount of meat one can presently consume and the willingness to exploit non-human animals. The political aspect of veganism is evident through the history of non-human animal liberation movements. Obviously, Animal Liberation Front and Earth Liberation Front are two movements that were constructed, let's say, 50 years ago. They were one of the major ones, and they were caused a lot of financial damage, and they were all intersectional in their nature, anti-hierarchical and anarchist in political outlook. So in order for us to move towards the liberation of both human, non-human, and the earth, we need to understand that speciesism, the way we view other living beings, is a part of human philosophy for thousands of years. So Torres was arguing that is far older and more entrenched in the human mind compared to racism. And then in order for us to create a society that can actually include non-human animals and earth within equal lines and non-oppressive, we need to move away from capitalism and anti-hierarchical, and we need to embrace anti-hierarchical ideologies. So I'm gonna continue here talking a little bit about mainstream veganism and white veganism. So KO is one famous vegan feminist author who was arguing that veganism needs to move away from being portrayed as a diet-based movement. And here I'm screenshotting to a definition, some question, like they are very evident with a Google search. So we can see how capitalism is trying to make money out of this new movement through embracing veganism as a healthy alternative and environmentally sustainable lifestyle. And it has been argued that this is part of green capitalism's plans to obviously make money out of anything. So white veganism, it's the concept of focusing only on non-human animal oppression. It's the single issue struggle of non-human animal rights. And it's normal that within a white society, people will be thinking that there is no other oppression other than non-human animals, because obviously non-human animal oppression is evident. You can see it physically, like it's very easy it's demonstrated daily. I found this research from Lidgren. She's done this research in Sweden, and it's a qualitative one. And there are not a lot of qualitative research on the link between veganism or non-human animal liberation and other forms of oppression. And her participants reported experiences of white vegans not being considerate, feelings of being disconnected and unwelcomed from the vegan community. And they also thought that Sweden portrays veganism as a white movement. Interestingly, my own research has found a similar pattern. Yeah, it's basically how the society, the system is trying to capitalize on an ethical movement. So this is my final slide. The key points that I agree with Nibert into how we can move towards interspecies liberation. First of all, we need to reframe racism into including speciesism and systemized under the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. We need to position species, including humans, as part of the animal kingdom. As Nibert argues that when we refer to animals as such, we distinct ourselves as part of the animal kingdom. And he claims that this is a social classification and a political act to hide diversity and place non-human animals at a distance. We also need to consider that non-human animal and earth liberation, as well as human liberation, will not come within a capitalistic society. We need to look at veganism and non-human animal liberation as an anti-hierarchical, anti-capitalistic, and decolonial movement. I'm just gonna put the references for whoever is watching the video on YouTube in case they want to read a bit more. And yeah, that was my presentation. I don't know how long, if I have a little bit more time.
So I think that's good for here, Rafa, if we could go to the Q&A.
Right.
Okay.
How do I go there? Let me stop sharing.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, let me know if there are any questions.
Yeah, so thank you, Rafa. Thank you for that. So yeah, if anyone has questions, please type them into the chat box. I don't believe I saw any come up. If I missed something, of course, someone please let me know. But we'll give you some time to formulate questions. So we're waiting a little bit. I think it is really.
People are raising their hand.
Yeah, there's that. Yep, that as well. Yeah, but I think the historical context is really important. It's always good to keep that in mind because it still underlies a lot, if not all of the problems we still have. Like those running historical currents of oppression linger. So it's good to cover that and to always keep those in mind, or that history in mind. So, all right, we'll see. We'll see if any questions come in. You can, feel free to say anything. Drop comments, drop questions, whatever you might have for Rafa. I guess I mean, I kind of noticed one thing, Rafa, that I could ask you about, and so you were talking at one point about vegans. You said vegans are 15 times more likely to be liberal than conservative, and I guess that's certainly not surprising. I always wonder about the conservative vegans, though. So the ones that are less likely to sort of be, I guess. Do you have maybe any sort of comment on that, of like the more unlikely, vegan, the conservative vegan?
This is the one part that I forgot to mention because I was obviously with the time. Right, so yes, obviously there are conservatives who are vegans and there are alt-rights who are vegans. The difference is there is not a lot of research yet, but this is what the research is saying at this moment. First of all, relapsing from a vegan diet into going back into an omnivorous diet is it can be predicted from political ideology. So if you're a conservative, you're more likely to go back into eating meat. And secondly, health veganism. So conservatives are viewing veganism as a self-interest like type of diet. So I'm not gonna be eating meat because it's better for my health. When we are actually saying we're not gonna be eating meat because it's better for the non-human animals. This is the main difference. So yeah, this is why I'm focusing a lot into how we can move away from health veganism into ethical veganism. Because obviously when we're talking about a healthy diet, more people are gonna be following it. And then when it becomes mainstream, it's very hard. The point, the philosophy behind it gets lost. Like when I was looking, it's quite interesting that not a lot of people understand the history of veganism. It's like, for me, I found out about veganism through Animal Liberation Front, and I knew about the political outlook and the way they worked, and this is how I philosophized it. But it's quite interesting how people do not understand, who do not see who brought them basically this idea of non-human animal oppression. So yeah, conservatives are being vegan for health-related reasons, and yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So we do have a question here, and so you might be able to see this as well. But so Anthony's saying Malcolm X stated that the most dangerous person is a white liberal. So can you talk about how liberals are more dangerous, or can be more dangerous than conservatives, and how liberals or neoliberals are different from radicals and revolutionaries? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, first of all, the way I understand liberals and conservatives, it's a different concept in America than it is in Europe. So, like when I'm listening to American politics, there are a lot of things that I disagree with the liberal position, and I understand that like Sanders is more liberal compared to Biden, if I'm not wrong. Anyway, I'm not I'm not placing myself within this dualistic perception when you're either left or right or in the central. I claim myself to be an anarchist. I don't see this kind of hierarchies. It's just that we need to, this research, like if you noticed, the majority of the research is recent one. So it's within from 2000, 2020. And this is a reflection of when non-human animal liberation is starting to be of interest in humanistic sciences. So when they do this research and they see, they need to frame it in mainstream ways for people to understand. So it's a very raw data. So when they talk about liberals, they're placing people into a very broad category. Obviously, yeah, I don't claim myself to be a left wing. I claim not even a far left wing. For me, anarchism is something completely different within the two way of seeing the two-party system, basically. Yeah, I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, I think that's very good, Rafa. Thank you very much. So I think in interest of time, we should go ahead and move to the next presenters. So let me pull up the info so I know exactly what I'm saying here. So our next presenters are Zane McNeill and Rebecca Eli Long. Rebecca Eli is a multidisciplinary scholar activist who uses lived experiences of disability to imagine a socially just, sustainable future for all body minds. Rebecca Eli has an MA in Appalachian Studies from Appalachian State University, and they are currently a doctoral student in the Department of Anthropology and Center on Aging and the Life course at Purdue University. Their research explores the links between disability, violence, and activism with a commitment to applying disability justice principles in campus and community settings. Zane McNeill is an activist scholar whose co-edited collection, Queer and Trans Voices, Achieving Liberation Through Consistent Anti-Oppression, was recently released by Sanctuary Publishers. Their second anthology, Y'all Means All, The Emerging Voices Queering Appalachia, is forthcoming from PM Press. And so Rebecca Eli and Zane's presentation is titled Toxicity and Multi-Species Disability in Duplin County, North Carolina. So you two are all set whenever you're ready.
Thank you.
I'm just going to share my screen here.
Yep, looks good.
Excellent. So I'm Rebecca Eli Long, and today Zane and I are going to talk a little bit about our paper, Queering the Animate Body, Toxicity, Ecoability, and Multi-Species Solidarity in Duplin County, North Carolina. We think that by reorienting Duplin County through frameworks of queer ecologies and ecoability, it can become a site of resistance in the service of queer possibilities. This creates a framework to think through disability, animal rights, and environmentalism that fights against industrialized farming and the capitalist food regime. So we're using Duplin County as a case study here. It is in the eastern portion of North Carolina, as you can see on the map here, outlined in blue. It confines more than 8.5 million animals in concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, more commonly known as factory farms. And it's also the top hog producing county in the United States. And some estimates claim that hogs outnumber humans by 30 to 1. And on the human side of the population of Duplin County, it's about 60,000 people, and more than 20% of which live within half a mile of a factory farm or a manure pit. These manure pits, which are euphemistically called lagoons, have been the subject of attention, especially as they have flooded in recent years due to hurricanes, such as Hurricane Florence in 2008, Hurricane Matthew in 2016, and Hurricane Floyd in 1999. More than 100,000 hogs drowned during Hurricane Floyd, and their carcasses were left to float downriver to the ocean, along with hog excrement. And so in the aftermath of these hurricanes, E. coli levels spiked in public wells, which compromised the safety of drinking water. And as these extreme weather events increase due to anthropogenic climate change, such events could become more regular, allowing little time for these communities to recover in between hurricanes. And it's also important to note that Duplin County is part of the Black Belt region in the United States South, which is a region that has historically relied on a large enslaved population and plantation-based economy. And there's also a growing population of Hispanic farm workers, as well as some members of the Lumbee tribe of Native Americans that live in Duplin County as well. So, in addition to contributing to the death of millions of hogs and pigs throughout North Carolina, these CAFOs generate toxins that contaminate the air and groundwater. The public health and environmental impacts of this are wide-ranging. People living near these CAFOs complain about the smell and report headaches, stomach pains, and depression, among many other health concerns. One of the most immediately notable impacts of living near a farm or a manure pit is the smell. Farmers will routinely use animal waste as fertilizer and spray it on crops. This waste contains dangerous toxins, including antibiotic-resistant bacteria, heavy metals, and greenhouse gases. The odor is described as reminiscent of rotten eggs and ammonia. And so this pervades the air and even seeps into houses. One study of Eastern North Carolina residents shows that exposure to hog processing odors caused an increase in tension, anger, depression, and fatigue. And a study in the North Carolina Medical Journal found that communities living near factory farms have higher rates of infant mortality, anemia, kidney disease, and tuberculosis. One Duplin County resident says that mostly everybody in this neighborhood got asthma or even cancer. My neighbor there died from cancer probably just last year. My nephew down the street, he's got cancer. He's in terminal stage 4. Not a smoker, not a drinker. And it's not in his lungs, it's in his lymph nodes. And an environmental health professor at the University of Maryland says that the effects of hog farm pollution go well beyond noxious odors. He says you have exposures through air, water, soil. You have inhalation, ingestion, and dermal exposures. People have been exposed to multiple chemicals: hydrogen sulfide, particulate matter, endotoxins, nitrous compounds. Then you have a plume that moves. What gets into the air gets into the water. You have runoff from spray fields. These are complex environmental profiles. The toxins from hog slaughter leach into the earth and become incorporated into the environment. In addition to atmospheric pollution from greenhouse gases, toxins also impact the ground and surface water, which can have drastic impacts on the ecosystem, including overgrowth of bacteria, death of aquatic life, and unsafe drinking water. These effects are not limited to Duplin County, but as they get into the air and the water, they can travel downstream, and the toxins eventually make their way into the Atlantic Ocean. While the impacts of these toxins are diffuse and wide-ranging, they are also more strongly felt closer to the factory farms and the manure pits. A University of North Carolina study found that communities of color are between 1.39 and 2.18 times more likely to live within a 3-mile radius of a factory farm. And these researchers concluded that this was a clear example of environmental injustice. Working within the factory farms is also a source of disability. Factory farm workers face high levels of PTSD and workplace injury. In addition to workplace accidents, workers at hog CAFOs in one of the nearby counties, Bladen County, reports chronic muscle and nerve pain. One worker, as quoted in a Human Rights Watch report, says, "What they want to know is, can you still work without bleeding in the meat when you're injured on the job?" The health and environmental risks connected to CAFOs have been the subject of litigations and investigation. Multiple policy groups and NGOs, like Rural Empowerment Association for Community Help, Waterkeeper Alliance, and the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, monitor the pollutants, mostly focusing on air quality. In recent years, more than 24 lawsuits concerning these lagoons and their pig waste have been filed against Smithfield, which is the largest pork producer in Duplin County. These actions were primarily taken by marginalized communities, and the plaintiffs, for the most part, have often won these cases with settlements in the range of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. The recent legislation has limited who can be a plaintiff and restricts the filing of these lawsuits to within the first year of a CAFO's operation. A journalist described the slew of lawsuits targeting pork producers as the latest chapter in a decades-long battle. To outsiders, it may look like little more than a spat between neighbors, but at its heart, it's a story about poverty and racial inequality and how those forces play out in a state where the hog industry has emerged as both essential for the economy and an oppressor of poor communities of color. Exposure to debilitating conditions is impacted by issues of poverty and race, where some bodies are more prone than others to be exposed to workplace and environmental dangers. At the heart of questions of poverty and racial inequality is ableism, defined as systemic oppression that leads to people in society determining who is valuable or worthy based on their appearance and or their ability to satisfactorily produce, excel, and behave. And people of color have historically been understood to be deviant and deficient, which has exacerbated marginality and the conditions that foster disability through impoverishment and violence. Working in and living near CAFOs is one such site of capitalist violence that is wrought on devalued bodies. Non-human animal bodies are also devalued and subjected to violence. And Zane and I think that the eco-ability movement offers a chance to discuss these connected but not identical forms of violence, as well as their broader impacts on the environment.
So queer studies, disability studies, and eco-ability decenter the normative subject and envision ways of building multi-species connected communities. So when we were working on this paper, we were trying to use Duplin County as a case study to understand these larger questions and larger theories of whose body matters, what polluted politics looks like, how we can build multi-species solidarity with both marginalized farm workers, communities that are suffering from environmental racism, and the animals themselves. And so the first question is really what queer means, and I think it's usually very often misunderstood. I took a class on queer ecologies in college, and it took me about the whole semester to figure out it just didn't mean LGBT. So queer theory, it can mean LGBT, but queer theory itself is focused on the deviant, on the big letter like other. So that which is seen as the inferior in dualisms. So in decentering the normative human subject, we emphasize that humanity is a small part of nature, not separate. Embodiments, including disability, are also connected to and created by environmental interactions. Such an understanding builds on Alison Kafer's political relational mode of disability, which positions disability as a set of practices and associations that can be critiqued, contested, and transformed. Recognizing the political relational aspects of disability can reveal the inequalities that concentrate disabled ecologies in certain places. The category of quote unquote disability, as it engages with racism and classism, opens the way for further disablement under practices capitalist projects such as factory farming. Animal farming is a practice of violence that causes multi-species disability. It is a social injustice that can mark a body, steal a body, feed lies, and poison a body, as Eli Clare has stated. Such practices have been understood through the eco-ability paradigm, which recognizes how the animal and disability rights movement fight against normative conceptions of value and worth. Hog farming's relation to disability, both human and non-human, is a productive site for examining the impacts of the eco-ability paradigm. Eco-ability joins multiple social justice movements to recognize how animals and people with disabilities are impacted by normative conceptions of ability and competence that are often categorized as subhuman. And it recognizes the shared concerns between animal advocacy, disability, and the environment, as well as the ways in which these movements experience friction and sometimes work against each other, calling for a stronger collection of liberatory movements. So communities in Eastern North Carolina that are dealing with these toxins, both literal and metaphorical, following Mel Chen's description of what a toxin is as an invading figure, a toxic pollution threatens and invades already stigmatized communities. These toxins bring disability to the local communities and CAFO workers, as well as non-human animal death for the sake of capitalism. Toxins disrupt and challenge the boundaries between life and death and queer understandings of what it means to be in/human. Toxins have physical effects, but they're also impacted by toxic constructs and systems of oppression. The theoretical tool of the toxin allows us to examine socio-political structures that are themselves toxic and damaging. Toxins also have real material impacts on the environment of Duplin County, which creates disabled and disabling environments. This way of approaching disability shows that is created through relational, multi-species encounters. This understanding of toxicity and disability is inherently queer and queering. Hog farming can be classified as a toxic chemical pollution responsible for undermining or perversion of the natural. This destabilization of the normative troubles the cultural nature divide and challenges the assumption that nature as a natural or neutral independent categories. This fit-unfit dualism is a construction integral to the cultural institutions that prioritize the lives as well-being of the normative body and the detriment of the non-normative body, which is pathologized, restricted, and policed. This dualism supports capitalistic projects that lead to toxic dumping in poor, rural, and urban areas that are often filled with BIPOC communities. This toxic dumping effectively leads to the destruction of the bodies of these affected communities, and this ableism is inherently a tool of violence institutionalized in our system. Hog farming shows how multiple types of bodies are subjected to ableism and deemed less than able. This ableism contributes to further disability as animals are maimed and murdered, workers experience injury and PTSD, and multi-species communities experience a host of other ailments. So animality, as we heard in previous presentations, has heavily figured into oppressions for those who are already deemed less than the ideal white male capitalist citizen. The positioning of POC as animals have justified slavery, eugenics, colonialism, and continue to do so. These violences also make people of color more likely to experience disability and to be disabled. Disabled people have also been animalized. Through experiences of disability being intertwined with racialized experiences, these connected experiences are being perceived as unintelligent, freaks, and less valuable because of these connections to animality. As many writers who contribute to the eco-ability movement have elaborated, the shared framings of animality and disability have been used to oppress various groups, including those in the non-human world. And these connections make the animal a powerful point of critique and multi-species liberation because it shows that animality is used to devalue certain bodies, both human and non-human. Next slide. So ecological disablement asks us to take a broad view of the systemic ways that disability is created and its more than human impacts. Hog farming has caused disability to spread through the ecosystem in Duplin County, and which is considered a site of environmental racism, places both POC, literally and figuratively, close to animality and disability. As toxins flow through the landscape, they impact every aspect of the environment. This is a transcorporeal effect that shows that bodies are not individual and bounded. Neither are our movements for social justice. As a site of injustice, Duplin County shows interconnected violences, especially among those who are already multiply marginalized. While the effects of toxins are most pronounced in the impoverished, predominantly Black and Hispanic communities of North Carolina's Black Belt region, they also travel through the landscape to impact communities further downstream. We cannot argue against ableism without reckoning with the forms of violence that cause disproportionate harm to Black and brown body minds. Nor can we see an end to factory farming without understanding the ways in which the category animal has figured into the creation of the white, cis, heteropatriarchal settler colonial state. While ableism has different impacts across different groups, it has consistently served to devalue bodies. Connecting our understanding of ableism with eco-ability shows that ableism also impacts the non-human environment. The non-human world on our own is inherently intertwined, and we can imagine a futurity created by this multi-species solidarity that challenges the neoliberal capitalist system and dismantles the systemic violence that harms human and non-human communities in its drive for profit. Recognizing these entanglements between the non and the human creates an important opportunity for us to challenge what is considered normative, connect and integrate social movements that have historically been in their own separate silos, and subvert and dismantle the cis heteropatriarchal state that threatens, targets, and poisons non-human bodies, the environment, and marginalized human communities for the capitalist project. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca, Eli, and Zane. That was great. Okay, so we have time for Q&A. So if there's any questions, again, please type that in the chat box and I can relay it to the presenters. And again, I'll try to give a little time for people to formulate or type questions. So we got some good praiseworthy comments. Yeah, that was a nice, very, I don't know the right word, sort of, I want to say focused study around Duplin County in particular. So I really kind of appreciated the place-based aspect of that. So again, maybe while people think or whatnot, I'd like to ask both of you, whenever there is kind of a project around, kind of centered around a particular place, I'm just kind of curious as to why or how that particular place kind of became centered, at least in your title and whatnot. So could one or both of you speak to why the, sorry, Duplin County, is that how you pronounce it? Yeah, that was the sort of place or region of choice?
I'll start. So we were invited to do a chapter for Anthony Uccello's book on ableism and speciesism, which is really cool. And so we were trying to figure out a case study that we could use these larger theories for. And Duplin County is just super notorious for the number of animals slaughtered, as well as class action lawsuits, as well as environmental degradation. And we're both interested in, we're both Appalachian scholars as well. And Duplin County is not in Appalachia, but it's close enough that I thought it would connect well enough. And so that was the idea that I put forward. What do you think, Rebecca, Eli?
Yeah, I think that just about sums it up. I'm from elsewhere in North Carolina, Warren County, which is often thought of as one of the homes of the environmental justice movement. So I feel some sort of at least emotional connection to sort of the broader slice of Eastern North Carolina that does have these larger histories.
It was actually really funny because after we were almost complete with our draft, I started working as a paralegal at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. And they are part of the coalition that works with the Waterkeeper Alliance and these other groups that were suing on this. So I got to actually work on that case.
Oh, wow. Nice. All right, thank you. Thank you for answering that. Okay, so we have a couple questions. Well, there's one comment about a special journal issue on animality, posthumanism, disability by, let's see, it looks like the New Literary History. That's the journal, I believe, and that link was given in the chat, so people can check that out for kind of a little bit more on this sort of general topic, wider scope. And then, so a couple questions here. Let's see if we can get to these. So the first one is asking about the DiGiro paper. Is that the same person who has written on the Anthropocene? And then also about that, can you please type out the book reference for the chapter you just mentioned that covers your presentation? So the DiGiro paper and your co-authored forthcoming book chapter.
Rebecca, Eli is a little more familiar with Giovanna DiGiro's work on the body home. If you could speak to that.
That's funny because I was just thinking you were the one who added that into the paper. It's like, that is Zane's question.
We'll go ahead and send you the citation there. And then the book, Anthony, I don't know if you want to jump on that. I'm pretty sure it's still under review. I don't think it's been published yet. Anthony will let us know. But it's between Amber George and Anthony Uccello were co-editing that volume. And there's some really, really great chapters in it. But from what I think it's still in the publishing pipeline from what I know.
Yeah, I've been not involved, but I'm aware of that book. So we might be able to at least type out the title of the book to let people know what to, okay, so Anthony's commenting here.
It is being printed soon.
Yeah, okay, so maybe you have to wait on some of that info. Of course, I don't want to give away anything I can't, but yeah, so ecoability certainly is something to try to follow that realm through ICAST. There's the Ecoability Collective, and they have a Facebook page. And then whenever it does come out, or at least is available for pre-order, something that'll be on ICAST site, Ecoability site, Amazon, although don't want to necessarily promote Amazon, but at least it can be a place to find out about these books. Okay, so let's see if we can get to Anthony's question as well then. So Anthony was asking, so there's been a lot of talk about race today in all the presentations so far. So can you talk about the difference between racism and white supremacy in the animal liberation and vegan movement, and how we erase BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, by saying this movement is really white, which it is not. So it is how we, the white people, define animal liberation and who counts, which is part of imperialism. So what are your thoughts on this?
I can jump on this first. I've tried to write a little bit about this, mostly for white vegans trying to make our movement less trash. But veganism and Afro-veganism is people have been doing this work, the work that I'm doing right now for decades, and just haven't had the platform I've had because of my whiteness. So a lot from a lot of the BIPOC activists I know who've been part of this movement forever, have been doing this work, have been doing the same kind of critiques of focusing on single issue veganism, and haven't been listened, which is a very, obviously because of oppressive structures of whose voices are valued and listened to and who is seen as an authority on something. But from what I know, BIPOC are actually going towards plant-based diets and vegan praxis larger than any other sort of group, but they don't have the same access and don't want to go in the same toxic environments of the animal welfare protection movement. There's been a lot of work recently on exactly that, especially since George Floyd's murder. Fortunately, a lot of it's performative. These groups just want to write off that they are good with DEI and be done with it. But there are really cool organizations and activists going forward. There's a group right now called RAW that just started that is focused on unionization efforts with animal rights groups, really focusing on how to fight against toxic environments in AR. Obviously, Encompass does a lot of work. Critical Diversity Solutions does a lot of work. But I also know a lot of BIPOC folks who are vegan who don't like the word vegan because it's so entrenched with issues of white supremacy, that veganism has been weaponized against these populations since I think its inception, really. Just like I know a lot of Black women who don't want to consider themselves feminists because feminism has a history of being entrenched with white supremacy as well. And so when you are trying to figure out what veganism means or what animal liberation means, animal rights, this kind of discourse is also really about power. So yeah, when Anthony's saying like who counts and who gets to operationalize these words, that is inherently a powerful political project. And if white voices are the ones who are heard, who take these spaces and oppress, eclipse, and marginalize BIPOC voices, then that's the way that the dominant narrative is seen. But really should be supporting these Black activists who have been doing this work for decades. And obviously we talked about AFCO, and Mariska just said they wanted to jump in as well. So I don't know if you want to just unmute, Mariska.
Oh, sorry, I really did not mean to sort of steal your moment.
Oh, please.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, yeah, I basically said it that, I mean, I was just asking for some clarification because I did not know if I understood the question correctly. But I sensed I read as sort of as if there's a difference between racism and white supremacy, which I don't think there is. Obviously, for me, there and building on the works of Black scholars, these are two sides of the same coin. But so indeed, I think there is obviously a risk in portraying movements, animal advocacy movements, as white. And obviously I do agree that should be contextualized and situated as well. For example, here in the Netherlands, the Animal Party is definitely a white party. It grew from a white politics, it grew from a white understanding of what politics is and of what race is. This may look some differently elsewhere. Also, what I think is important to keep in mind here is that not only sort of invisibilizes people of color who are involved in animal movements, but it also invisibilizes that type of animal advocacy and animal politics that is being done. And I think this is what Zane also just said, but I'm not sure if I understood that correctly either, because I was typing as well. that they may do something well, we do not necessarily recognize as animal politics or animal advocacy as such, but it is still very much engaged with the animal question for pro-animal issue, from the perspective of a pro-animal stance as well. So it also sort of, I think we need to sort of maybe also change our ways, and this is also where I guess I come in with my critique on speciesism as a term and how we usually deploy it in these spaces, to sort of really broaden our scope to see what is actually happening as well. Because I think that somehow sort of the narrative is very, well, like this, I don't know the word for that in English. And that it sort of prevents us looking and recognizing other types of politics.
Yeah, I think I recently wrote this piece about how working in Black Lives Matter movement, being active in food justice work is inherently vegan politics. When you move away from veganism as a diet to a praxis, I think that's inherently the right, because it doesn't look like veganism if you operationalize it as a diet. But if you understand veganism as a politics, then when you're engaging in subterranean politics, when you're solidarity, mutual aid shares, like that itself is vegan politics. Rebecca, Eli, would you like to add anything there? Sorry, I kind of took up all the space there.
I think you and Mariska both have already given sort of a really thorough answer to this question, and I don't think I can really add on it too much more.
Yeah, I think what the way we understand how we define what racism is and white supremacy is what Anthony is also saying is very imperative. Usually it's interesting because when I usually think of white supremacy, I think of as structural, but I guess it can also be cognitive. So like usually understanding these terms, and there's so many different ways to understand these terms, it's really important for us to all use the same language to be able to build futures together around challenging that.
So if I can jump in really quick, for Anthony's point as well, there was a recent, another research, it wasn't very scientific though, it was a Gallup, a poll. Basically they were saying that Black people were more likely, like nearly 8 times, to be vegan than white people, and also females, women are like 75% more likely to be, they are vegan compared to like 25% of men. And yet we see that non-human animal advocates, like popular ones, are majority white men. When we're talking about white veganism and what people of color are referring to as white veganism, is not the fact that it's a white movement in a sense that inherently, because of our skin color, regardless of whether or not we belong into other marginalized groups, it's quite difficult for us to be anti-racists fully. I remember seeing this quote that was saying the best thing a white person can be is an anti-racist racist, which is quite interesting because the microaggressions that we commit ourselves unconsciously, because we have been brought up not thinking about how skin affects different people, can make people of color feeling disempowered and not included within the vegan movement, especially the way we try to advocate for non-human animal liberation. So going back to what we were saying earlier about if we think about veganism as a health problem, then obviously people are not going to be listening to this because it's a diet, it's food, you know, people prefer to eat something that's easier. But if we actually commit ourselves into focusing into the ethical reasons and how the oppressive system through colonization and capitalism has has oppressed humans, non-humans, and the earth, then we can actually create spaces for people of color to actually come forward and give us their ideas. And it's my personal contention that when people of color are saying something we actually need to be actively listening to them, because they are the ones that they have a larger image of the vegan movement and what they think is negative, let's say. So a lot of Afro-vegan feminist people have been addressing the problem of white veganism. And it's quite interesting to read their perspective, because it offers a completely different narrative than the one that we are used to.
And Nathan, if you don't mind me just jumping on really fast, I know we have to move to the next speaker. But I just wanted to illustrate that I think the majority of us on this call are white. And I try to, in my work, be very critical of my whiteness and be very open of that. But obviously, being an accomplice or an anti-racist isn't an identity. It's something we're always trying to work towards. And I obviously have internalized issues with racism and white supremacy, as I imagine all of us do, who are white. And so the idea that even this space is very white dominant, it's not because BIPOC populations don't find value in these conversations, but because something about the way that critical animal studies is done, or this conference specifically, doesn't seem like exactly inherently a safe space that centers these voices. It's not like the BIPOC populations aren't doing this work. And so that's something we need to be, I think, very conscious of, about why, this is a white space, why, even though we're speaking about being critical of our whiteness, we're trying to speak for people who aren't here. And I think that's something that I've just been very conscious of while we've been having this conversation. So just to highlight that.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and a very important discussion that, of course, needs to keep happening everywhere as widely as possible. But so I do think in interest of time, we should move to the next speaker. Discussions can continue in the chat though. So I want to say thanks to Zane and Rebecca Eli for their presentation and the ensuing discussion it engendered. So we'll move on to our next and our last presentation of the day. And so this is by Kiana Avlon. Kiana Avlon is a graduate student in Westminster College's Master of Arts in Community Leadership program. She has presented research on the rhetoric surrounding houselessness in Salt Lake City and the root causes of speciesism at the Western Social Science Association Conference and the annual North American Conference for Critical Animal Studies. Kiana continues to study rhetoric as it pertains to speciesism with a focus on countering eco-fascism within the animal liberation movement. She grounds her research in critical animal studies, anarchism, and ecofeminism with the goal of total liberation. Her free time is dedicated to volunteering at local animal sanctuaries. And Kiana's presentation is titled Alt Vegan, an exploration into the far-right infiltration of animal rights. So Kiana, when you are ready.
Thanks, Nathan. Just to preface, my internet dropped, so if the audio starts lagging, if someone could just shout, I'll connect my hotspot and hopefully it cooperates. So just want to preface with that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hopefully it works. It looks like it's up and running now, but we'll see. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, looks good.
All right. Sounds like audio is cooperating, but yeah, please feel free to interrupt if it cuts out. But hi everyone, thanks to Nathan and all the organizers and the folks that joined today. I always really look forward to CAS conferences, so I'm happy that we could all gather virtually. All right, so the purpose of my presentation is to reflect on a case study of animal liberation activists in the Intermountain West who previously participated in Anonymous for the Voiceless, or AV, Cuba Truths, and they left based on the comments that the leadership's social media account they were posting. So I'll start by briefly contextualizing the research in the larger issue of a far-right presence in factions of the animal liberation movement. So one reason that the far right has taken interest in the animal liberation movement is to try and manage their optics by using veganism as a guise for innocence or creating a perception of themselves as masculine protectors. And the far right often uses co-optations of the animal rights or other movements to push this version of quote unquote solutions rooted in violence and scapegoating. So unsurprisingly, their goal is not liberatory, and rhetoric is an important part of understanding far-right co-optation because factions of the far-right intentionally infiltrate social justice and environmental movements by co-opting some of the left's language and leveraging shared concerns about environmental degradation and capitalism. So Anonymous for the Voiceless, otherwise referred to as AV, is a global organization that does educational outreach in cities across the globe where participants hold screens displaying graphic footage of animal exploitation, while others are outreaching pedestrians who choose to stop by and watch the footage. AV operates under the guiding philosophy that animal rights are entirely unrelated to human rights or any other social justice movement. The organization is vehemently opposed to an intersectional approach to animal rights activism. So before diving into some of the screenshots from AV, I want to mention that I'm specifically critiquing the top leadership of AV, not the many volunteers. In one of the interviews during this research project, a participant brought up that many people organizing for AV chapters may have really positive experiences in their local chapters and be just fully disconnected from AV social media and like the interviews that they do. I definitely fell into that category for like a year. So I think it's important to be clear that my critique is like specifically directed at AV leadership. I can't speak to like the ideologies and beliefs of the participants in AV. Also, as far as I'm aware, the leadership at AV hasn't explicitly stated their political alignments, so I can't neatly categorize their ideology. However, based on reviewing like many of their social media accounts and interviews, I think that they're often espousing far-right rhetoric. So to show a few of the many red flags that illustrate AV's politics, I'm going to share a few examples of their posts and direct quotes from their videos and interviews. So the first one on this slide is an excerpt I transcribed from a video of Paul and Azal. Paul and Azal are the two leaders of AV, and they made this video regarding pronouns. So in the conversation, Paul and Azal use pseudoscience to make it clear that trans and non-binary people aren't welcome to participate in their activism. And they also infer that like any identity outside of someone who's cisgendered is not rooted in biology. They also take a condescending tone with their statement that gender is a political agenda to minimize gender identity. The other piece of this excerpt that stands out is how they try to depoliticize animal rights by saying that any other topic is political and can't be part of a cube when animal rights itself is deeply political. So their attempted rationalization that gender pronouns are irrelevant to the activism is nonsensical given the communication that has to occur to coordinate these events. And regardless, the fact that they even like felt the need to announce that participants should make a conscious effort not to introduce themselves is enough of a warning sign. Okay, so in addition to Paul and Azal's transphobia, the following slide here is their response to the Black Lives Matter protest this summer. I decided not to include the original image because it's graphic and I don't want to reshare an image that's really a disservice to the movement, especially if it's taken out of context to further perpetuate AV's narratives rather than countering them. But there's a description on the left-hand side of what was in the image. It was a photo of a Black man holding up a decapitated pig head at a protest. And then underneath is the description from AV. And they wrote in their description, like overlaid on the image, hypocrisy is protesting against animal rights violations while violating the rights of others. So in response to the heightened awareness and conversations and actions regarding systemic racism and the state violence carried out by police forces, this was the one post that AV shared in response. And it's important because it demonstrates that contrary to the claims that Paul and Azal often make that AV is apolitical, their decision to post this image was a deeply political choice and indicative of their ideology. They took one photo of one protester and used it to attack an entire social justice movement. More specifically, I also find it telling that they chose an image of a Black protester and portrayed them this way as like their one and only comment. So as I want to reference Jay Conroy, who pointed out on his channel, The Cranky Vegan, that they could have highlighted the use of police horses trampling people or police weaponizing dogs to attack protesters. And then another point I want to make is that, to my knowledge, AV hasn't made comments taking issue with how often organizations within the animal liberation movement use dead animals as props for protests, performance art, and other actions. So AV's choice to post this particular image with this caption is telling of where Paul and Azal stand on human liberation, specifically these particular uprisings. I also think I also included text that's on the right-hand side of this slide, and that's an excerpt from a video that Paul posted, kind of doubling down on this initial post after receiving backlash. So in this excerpt, he once again uses this logic, or lack thereof, that animal liberation is somehow uniquely apolitical, while every other social justice movement is merely a political agenda that's not worthy of consideration. So next, I want to spend some time talking about AV's views on intersectionality, since Paul and Azal's social media accounts are rife with posts and videos attacking intersectional approaches to the animal liberation movement. The term intersectionality, coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, is a tool to understand how multiple forms of inequality interact with one another. It's not a new totalitizing theory meant to explain all aspects of oppression, but a tool for considering the myriad of identities that impact how a person interacts with the world around them. In listening to the way that Paul and Azal describe intersectionality, it's apparent that their conception of this term is vastly different than the actual meaning that Crenshaw put forth. So first off, Paul and Azal use the term intersectionals or an intersectional with a derogatory tone to refer to anyone who takes an intersectional approach to their activism. Azal claimed in an AV video that it would be exclusionary for AV to consider anything other than the animals because everyone would have to agree on multiple topics to join. In her words, she said, "I think by adding different sections to one organization, you're actually making it more exclusive because everyone who joins has to tick all the boxes, whereas with AV, as long as you're a vegan and you want animal liberation, you're welcome to join us." So her conception that intersectionality is ticking off boxes to gain membership to participate in a social justice movement is just completely detached from Crenshaw's articulations of intersectionality. Paul and Azal view an intersectional approach to activism as a percentage breakdown of how much time is allocated to a given topic. So in an interview that they posted this past November, Azal talks about how she doesn't know anyone who claims to be, again, an intersectional is the term she uses, and actually covers all the issues because there's thousands of different things that you could talk about. So here she's conceiving of a person taking an intersectional approach as covering every single social justice issue in existence, which is, again, a complete misrepresentation of what intersectionality is. And then Paul also, adds to Azal's remark that you have to choose your cause because it's impossible for you to fight to end all of them at once. So like Azal, Paul's framing intersectionality as an attempt to address every single problem in existence, and then uses this misrepresentation to conclude that an intersectional lens in our activism doesn't build an effective movement. So this is divorced from Crenshaw's description of intersectionality as a tool to understand how multiple forms of inequality interact with one another. And intersectionality is not about setting an expectation that everyone must be an expert and involved in every single social justice issue that's ever existed. Rather, it's a way to see how identity informs people's lived experiences and helps us to better understand others' perspectives. So another problem with AV's leadership is their inability to see how it's helpful to draw connections between different social justice movements. In that same interview that I just mentioned in the previous slide, Paul returns to the strategy of condescending to any other social justice movement by calling it, in quotes, whatever the mainstream issue is of the time. And Azal then chimes in with the quote on this slide, which I think highlights Azal and Paul's inability to forge connections between social justice movements and identify the shared root causes of many systemic problems. So by saying this, it's clear that a critique of a larger system like capitalism, for example, that's intertwined with speciesism and sexism and necessitates poverty is not on their radar. And to address this quote from Azal, I also want to share something one of the participants just described during an interview for my research that I think highlights the need to consider someone's material circumstances as an obligatory context. So using pseudonyms here, Jordan participated in a Cube of Truth in California that Paul and Azal attended, where Paul and Azal criticized an outreacher for talking with a woman who was describing her situation experiencing houselessness because they believed that she was letting this unhoused woman get control of the conversation. And this illustrates the damage that a single issue movement creates by viewing outreach conversations as a power struggle where the outreacher has to keep the other person person, only talking about animals and not letting them come to, talk about any other topics because that's viewed as a threat to the main discussion. For this reason, the participant Jordan felt that having empathy towards someone else's situation is better than following the script that AV shares with participants in cubes, because using her words, that script can be really harmful to a lot of people. So this personal anecdote highlights why the animal liberation movement is not a standalone issue. We need to understand other struggles, the systems that perpetuate multiple forms of oppression, and account for the material reality of the audience that we're engaging with. So to explore the barriers preventing the movement from embracing an intersectional approach, I engaged in research with a case study of animal liberation activists in a mid-sized city in the Intermountain West to investigate their understandings of the role of intersectionality in the animal liberation movement. All of the activists previously participated in AV, and they left to create a local grassroots organization during the summer of 2020. This was in response to a slew of alarming social media posts from AV, and these posts led to increased criticism and backlash from the animal rights community and escalated to AV chapters around the globe in Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, the United States, and other countries cutting ties with AV. For my methods, I conducted 5 open-ended semi-structured interviews. They lasted between 1 to 2.5 hours. The interview questions aim to specifically focus on their experiences with AV, as well as their perspectives on intersectionality. All of the participants were assigned pseudonyms for confidentiality. With the handful of previous examples of Paul Nozal's rhetoric to foreground the politics of AV, the next section explores the participants' responses to 2 posts from the social media accounts of Anonymous for the Voiceless and the accounts of the AV founders, Paul and Nozal. So a significant portion of each interview was the participants talking through their reactions to social media posts from AV. And the data illustrated that the activists were often left asking, who is this message targeted at and why is AV posting this? And this suggested to me that the movement is not operating from a common understanding that organizations like AV may call themselves politically neutral, but their content suggests that they are signaling to those who are politically right of center. So for this first image, all of the participants agreed that this type of post was concerning. One participant, Charlie, pointed out how this is a dog whistle by noting AV's use of the word many to replace I, since he's seen this strategy with other right-wing media personalities. So this rhetorical strategy allows the leaders of AV to push these narratives without explicitly writing that they endorse them. The other 4 participants were primarily asking who's the audience of the comment and why would AV post it. So one participant, Nicole, responded that even if you want to be focused on non-human animals, I don't know why you would bother making posts like this that are going to shut a lot of people out of the movement. It doesn't seem worth it to me. So this question of why AV would post this type of content is key because it indicates that these activists may not be familiar with far-right groups that have co-opted veganism, making this a demographic that AV can pander to, or AV's willingness to incorporate people from the right into their organization, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes. So the person responsible for the post that we just looked at was AV's former social media handler, George Martin. While I didn't use these 2 images in the interviews, I hadn't found them at the time, I do want to include them now because I think it supports Charlie's conclusion that the word choice of many was a stand-in for I. And as we can see here on George's personal account, he's explicitly writing, it's his personal belief that systemic oppression doesn't exist in the West. So here is another image I showed each participant during the interviews. Like I talked about for the first image, the participants had similar questions when they read this post, primarily asking who is this for and why was it posted? So Jordan responded by saying, you kind of wonder that what AV is doing when they go off like this, especially when they post this kind of thing on the AV page. So again, the lingering question for the participants was why would AV post this content knowing that it's hurtful and who would be sympathetic to this messaging? Jordan believed that AV should reflect on questions such as, what am I really saying here? Who am I really talking to? Is this acceptable to the public? And similarly, Charlie asked about the intended audience, saying, I think it's tricky with this more Hitler content. I don't know what that really, if that really does anything too helpful. I'm not sure who that's winning over. So considering these types of posts from AV are a pattern, I find it apparent that they're comfortable utilizing right-wing language, and this pushes a co-opted version of veganism that's steeped in white supremacy and removes any prospect of total liberation. Another participant, Morgan, focused on what AV is inferring by saying that Hitler wrote an entire book about reasons for human oppression. She asked if they're implying a book makes it valid that humans can be oppressed. And that's exactly the implication that I guessed in reading this post. So now that I've shared the major questions and reflections from the participants, I want to talk about how Paul and Azal responded to this particular post in an interview this past November. According to Paul George, the one who was writing, using the AV handle for this post, wasn't saying legitimate justifications were afoot in those cases. He was saying that more reasons were provided by Hitler and his regime to the public than what non-vegans offer to the public regarding the injustices that they're involved in. So this vague explanation that George doesn't view the justifications as legitimate, but still felt inclined to point out the number of reasons included in Mein Kampf as part of his argument, seems like a very, very clear dog whistle to me. And to make matters more alarming, Paul went on to defend George by saying sometimes there's bias that's brought into the work that people are doing within AV. They bring their own biases, whether they're political or otherwise, in the way that they communicate. So in this framing, there does not seem to be any political ideology that's off limits to AV, no matter what the consequences are for marginalized populations. And while George Martin has been fired since this post, Paul and Azal in this interview make it abundantly clear that he was not fired for one particular post of this nature, but for multiple unspecified problems. They also emphasize that Paul was, quote, a prized member of their team, and remarked that, quote, it's tough to be in his position. It sucks to have to fire someone like George. So to make it perfectly clear, Paul and Azal have no remorse for this content of the post. Paul mentions that AV still has people in the organization with, quote, even stronger political views than George does. So for the sake of time, I just focused on 2 posts I included in the interviews for this research. But to reiterate one of the major overall findings from this research project, the question that continually came up was asking who AV's messages are trying to target and why would they post it. So after reviewing AV's social media accounts, their online videos, and their interviews, I believe that the repetition of offensive and discriminatory rhetoric is intentional. While the leadership has received pushback on this type of content, they continue to use dog whistles and they engage with far-right talking points. So by this point, I believe this speaks to their comfort level with including this type of exclusionary and hateful politics in the movement. When groups like AV present the animal liberation movement as a single issue that's disparate from all other social justice movements, the activists who comprise the movement are not encouraged to have a baseline knowledge of how the liberation of animals is interconnected with the liberation of all beings, including humans. In turn, this makes animal liberation activists less likely to consistently identify when dog whistles are surfacing in the movement or see how dangerous this type of language is. To get to the point where people can recognize the harm AV does for the movement, we need to analyze their rhetoric and consider the implications for these types of talking points. Across all 5 interviews with the participants, there was a general consensus that AV's blatantly anti-intersectional stance was ridiculous, offensive, and ineffective, yet the participants seemed to attribute this to ignorance and a poor choice of words rather than a conscious decision to use the vile messaging time and time again in what's supposed to be a liberatory movement. So developing a shared vocabulary to counter the misinterpretations of intersectionality that Paul and Azal repeat would benefit the animal liberation movement. The mainstream animal liberation movement at large struggles to define intersectionality and the need for an intersectional approach to advocacy. So when we see these dog whistles or posts blatantly attacking groups of people, we should take the time to unpack their rhetorical strategies, the inferences they're making, so they're not fooling people with masking their ideologies with phrases like many people believe, or their flimsy attempts to disprove the need for other social justice movements and present animal rights as apolitical. So my hope is that we can provide strong counter narratives to the anti-intersectional single issue approach that AV spreads. So our fellow animal advocates find the value in learning about other social justice movements and genuinely care about total liberation and recognize the interconnected nature of oppression, as well as a focus on building coalitions.
All right, thank you very much, Kiana. Like the other presentations, that was very important. Very important information and very well done. So we do have, of course, time for questions for Kiana. So like usual, if you could type those into the chat box. And it looks like we do already have one. So Kiana, have you noticed any increase in eco-fascist rhetoric in your animal rights community or the movement more generally to coincide with the pandemic?
I've been hearing a lot of comments, but, well, not a lot. I've heard a handful of comments in some of the circles I'm in about like specifically pertaining to the pandemic, saying that humans are the virus. And I'm generally a very like jaded and sarcastic person. So these are comments I didn't used to think a lot about. But having done this research, particularly like the past year to year and a half, that rhetoric like really deeply concerns me now after exploring websites from like different, factions of the alt-right and like eco-fascist websites. And I think it's super dangerous, and it's tricky to like have those conversations and explain to someone why that is potentially more dangerous than just making like a very jaded joke. Like there can be repercussions for those ideologies. So I've had a handful of, I've heard a handful of comments about that kind of stood out to me, that it felt like they increased during the pandemic, but quite frankly, I've only been, organizing within this movement for about 2 years. So like my time frame is pretty short to like make, an assessment on that. But I've for sure heard comments specifically about the virus and like people being the virus. And if people didn't exist, none of this would have happened. And I would push back against that narrative, because I don't feel comfortable saying that all people are the problem and we would be better off not existing. I think there's a lot of decisions that were historically made that have led us into the problems we're facing now, and people are not equally responsible for what has happened.
Yeah, thank you, Kiana. Okay, other questions for Kiana's presentation?
I will add, if anyone wants links to the videos I referenced or the screenshots, feel free to let me know. Some were kind of tricky to find. I had to take like screen recordings before they were removed. So if anyone does want those citations, I didn't focus too much on literature for this presentation, more so the actual like social media posts and responses. So if anyone does want those, direct links, feel free to let me know. I'm happy to share them.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for offering. Oh, yeah. Rafa would like to say something. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, very interesting paper as well. I have no idea that the Anonymous for the Voiceless were having this kind of mindset. I just wanted to comment 2 things. Like I was fuming when you were presenting your work. First of all, the Anonymous, aren't they the ones that have the mask of Gary Fox, isn't it? Yeah. It's quite interesting because that mask became famous from the movie V for Vendetta. And the story of Gary Fox, and the movie V for Vendetta has a clear political message. It's quite interesting how people are capitalizing on that aspect without embracing the political ideology behind. And the second thing is that while you were talking, I was going through the Instagram of Paul Bashir, if I'm not mistaken, and it seems like he identifies human supremacism as an issue. So I think it's quite optimistic in a sense that at least they acknowledge that there is some sort of hierarchy, supremacist, and someone is above someone else, and that's not, let's say, ethically right. In an ideal world, obviously, people would understand how different oppressions intersect and how they have been historically connected. But I think it's important to at least have them understand that there is one sort of oppression, and hopefully we can build our narrative through interactions better to include other oppressions. Because once you have this non-human animal oppression, which is physical and evident, like you can see it very easily on videos and stuff, you can start then discussing how this same system that oppresses non-human animals oppresses also humans, not necessarily physically, but more psychologically. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for that first point too. I actually hadn't really thought too much about the masks. In one of the interviews, we were both laughing about how we've Googled the history of those masks so many times. And whenever someone asks me, I like completely blank on it. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And for your second part too, I'll, expand on that too, that they, Paul definitely does say that human oppression exists in his post. Like he'll explicitly say that. But one of the ways that he says that, and this is like one example that comes to mind, is AV often encourages really offensive comparisons where they'll say, like what happens to animals is the Holocaust. And if someone pushes back and says, I'm not comfortable applying that terminology here, like we should have a different vocabulary to describe this, the response is, well, you're a human supremacist if you're not willing to call this a Holocaust. So he kind of weaponizes it to turn it around and be like, well, if you don't use these comparisons that I'm using, or if you don't want to use slavery and Holocaust comparisons, you're a human supremacist. So the way that he uses human supremacy, to me, is just like very intellectually dishonest, and it's not like a genuine concern for human oppression. One other example I'll share briefly that comes to mind is in one of the interviews I watched of them, to kind of like, and again, they don't say it explicitly, but to kind of infer that they don't support the BLM movement, as they say, well, these people didn't talk about something happening in Lebanon, therefore they're not intersectional because they weren't aware of every single thing that's happening, and like, therefore I can kind of ignore your feedback. So they also kind of use it to be like, if they misinterpret what intersectionality is, but then they weaponize human supremacy to say, like, if you don't agree with me, you're a human supremacist. So it was a lot to unpack. I appreciate those comments though. Those are great.
All right. Yeah. So thank you very much. So I think then this is a good time to start ending the event. So I would like to say it has been very humbling and inspiring to watch and to listen to the presentations today. And it's been a privilege and certainly a pleasure to work with the presenters in helping create this event. I think it's somewhat obvious, without them, this event at least wouldn't exist. But of course, I'm sure they all and more of us here would continue doing our important work anyway. But it's nice to bring people together like this and help disseminate this sort of critical dialogue and help push social justice issues forward. So I want to give a big thanks to all of the presenters. Thank you very much. And also want to say thanks to the audience members, the other attendees for coming and supporting this event, and CAS writ large, and all social justice activism and scholarship. So thanks. And again, this will be recorded and put up on the ICAST YouTube channel, and the link will be to that video will be given on the page for this event. So the 6th SCAS conference page will have the link to this YouTube, and we'll try to send it out on connections we have and things like that. So be on the lookout for that. And thanks again, and have a great rest of your weekend and days. Here we go. Bye.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Bye.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you, Kiana.